Good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the Public Policy Institute of California, and thank you for joining us today. I was going to say something about it's really warm outside, we really appreciate you coming, except now it's 85, and in Sacramento, after it hits 99, it's actually cold for us from Sacramento. So for our San Francisco folks, sorry, it's hot for you. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with think tank with offices in San Francisco and Sacramento. And for today's program, we're going to learn the findings of PPIC's latest statewide survey on Californians and their government. This survey was supported with funding from the James Irvine Foundation and the PPIC Donor Circle, and we'd like to thank them for their support for this work. And we'd also like to acknowledge the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of the event and our lunch. I hear we're almost out of beer bread, so you might want to run up there. At registration, you should have received a document that contains some of our key findings from the survey, and the full survey, as well as the slides, are now live online and will be made available hopefully for Everdeen, right? And there are crosstabs, my favorite part of the survey, online. After the presentation, you should have plenty of time for questions and answers. Please wait for the microphone because we are recording this event. Our next event, it's very exciting, will take place here on June 20th, and you'll learn the findings from a new report on recidivism of felony offenders in California. So you can sign up online on that. And later today, you'll receive a survey from our survey team. They like to do surveys, and we'd really like you to take a moment and answer that survey because it's very helpful for us. And please turn off your cell phones. So PPIC does approximately 8 surveys a year, and 3 are issue-specific. The K-12 survey in April, and I recommend you look at that if you were interested at all in following the LAUSD parcel tax, because I think we were spot on that issue in our April survey. Our July environmental survey, and our fall and winter higher education survey. Our May and June survey is actually really much more difficult because it's not a specific subject matter survey. And it's conducted at a really critical time in the legislative process. The questions are drafted and asked during the suspense committee process, the House of Origin deadline, and of course, as the budget's being negotiated. And this makes it hard to know what issues to include. And the Government Affairs team are just like you. We have a lot of questions we'd like to see asked in the survey. So we torment our survey team quite a bit during this time of year, and we appreciate their considerations of the information we provide for them. And this survey touched on so many of those critical issues that are being debated in the legislature and with the governor. How to address the state's housing crisis and homelessness, the public's view on crime and law enforcement, including variations by segments of our society and groups in our society, and the importance of census and voting. There's so much here to talk about, and I'm sure you notice there might be a few things missing. They missed the ladybug swarm in San Diego. I, for one, did not know ladybugs flew so high, and I always wondered where the ones I bought went, and now we know. And of course, they didn't poll every individual Democrat candidate for president, because we just didn't have the time. But Dean will explain that in more detail coming up. So now I'd like to bring up PPIC Associate Survey Director Dean Bonner, who will present the survey findings.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I would definitely like to thank Deborah. While they're bugging us to ask about things, there are resources that they provide for us on topics and questions and bills and policies that are being discussed are really just crucial to our process as we try to whittle down the many questions that we want to ask to the few questions that we actually can ask. So prior to getting into the survey's findings today, let's talk a little bit about the mission of the PPIC survey. Our goal is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions. And we hope to inform and improve the policymaking process, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. And part of our goal is to provide a voice for all Californians in important state policy debates. And in doing so, since 1998, we've interviewed well over 350,000 Californians in more than 170 surveys. This particular survey is part of our Californians in Their Government series, about 4 to 5 a year we do of those. And this particular survey, we did interviewing from mid to late in May, 70% on cell phone as well as 30% on landline phones. And we interviewed just over 1,700 Californians, and the margin of error on that is about 3.3%, and just over 1,100 likely voters that we discuss, and the margin of error on that is about 4%. So the survey report, which is available online, is broken into 2 sections, a state issue section that looks at views of elected officials, the state budget, housing policy, as well as vaccines. And then in the back half, we look at national issues, which include opinions of federal elected officials, the Mueller Report, the idea of possible impeachment of the president, as well as a first glimpse at the 2020 election. And yes, we did not poll about all 25 or 6, or I don't know. I haven't checked the news today, so it could be 27. But we will get to that point, especially given the role that California will play with the March primary next year. So let's dive right into the state issues. The governor's ratings continue to be stable since we first asked this in January, and really driven by partisanship. We find that 2 in 3 Democrats approve of the governor, while 4 in 10 independents, and just 13% of Republicans. You'll hear this a lot. Californians are divided across party lines, and so this is a prime example of that. We find that half in the Bay Area approve of the governor compared to fewer elsewhere, and Latinos are the most approving of the governor, but that's only at 51% compared to whites who are at 40%. We find that since January, the approval ratings of the legislature has dropped 10 points, and they're currently at their lowest point since July 2015. And so they were on a pretty long run of being above 40%, or even in recent months closer to 50%. But as they debate the budget and some of the other topics that have been discussed, we're seeing this little bit of decline. But we'll come back to that in our July and fall surveys to see kind of if this is just a blip, or is this something that's real given policy discussions. Half of Democrats approve of the legislature compared to far fewer Republicans and independents. And approval only eclipses 50% among Latinos across regions and demographic groups. So fewer than half across most demographic groups and regions actually approve of the legislature. So Governor Newsom was forced to face the PG&E bankruptcy really early on in his tenure. And what we see here, I know some of the colors are a little bit off depending on which screen you're looking at, but what we see here is that a plurality of Californians are really unsure of how to rate him on this issue. Not to be all that surprising, given that this is a topic that I think is it's a very important topic, but not something that people necessarily think about what the governor is doing on this particular issue. We find that 1 in 3 across regions approve, and despite approval across parties being low, there's a partisan divide with 4 in 10 Democrats approving, 3 in 10 independents approving of him on this issue, compared to 1 in 7 Republicans. And fewer than 4 in 10 across demographic groups actually approve of his handling of the PG&E bankruptcy. We also asked about the governor's approval as it relates to the issue of wildfire prevention and response. And what we find is that just under half actually approve on this issue, with about a third unsure. So once again, this is an issue that is not a lot of people have opinions on at this point, but his approval of wildfires is higher across most groups and regions than compared to the PG&E bankruptcy. So the PG&E bankruptcy has kind of added to some uncertainty around how much ratepayers will pay in electricity as there's discussions about what this bankruptcy will actually mean, whether there'll be localities step up to potentially segment those areas. But what we find is that nearly 8 in 10 Californians are concerned about rising electricity bills as a result of this. The share who are very concerned, we find that about half of Republicans compared to about 4 in 10 Democrats are very concerned about raising electricity bills. And the share who are very concerned are slightly higher in the Central Valley and the Inland Empire than elsewhere. And we see that the share who are very concerned is twice as high among those 55 and older compared to the 18 to 34-year-old group. And that renters are 10 points, the homeowners are 10 points more likely than renters to actually be very concerned about rising electricity bills. So from time to time, we like to not only ask about kind of the economic state of California, but also about personal financial situation. And what we find today is that just over 4 in 10 adults say that their personal finances are excellent or good. Asian Americans and white Californians are far more likely than African Americans and Latinos to say that their financial situation is at least good. And as you might expect, positive perceptions of their own financial situation increases sharply with rising income. And it's also much higher in the San Francisco Bay Area than elsewhere across the state. Speaking of the state, we also asked a question just about kind of future economic outlook of the state. And we found that, just 44% of Californians say that they expect good economic times in the next 12 months, while 47% say they expect bad economic times. So they're pretty divided on the future outlook of the state. And that's been consistent, very consistent in recent months and similar in January. So as housing affordability continues to be an issue, both that state policymakers attempt to resolve or lessen, it's also something that ordinary Californians view as a strain, with half of Californians saying that their housing costs causes a financial strain to them personally. And so what we also find is that this perception, as you might expect, declines sharply with rising income and is higher among African Americans and Latinos than other racial ethnic groups. More than half of Californians outside of the Central Valley feel that housing costs cause a financial strain. And there's interesting crosstabs when you look at those with children being more likely than those without children to say that this causes a strain, as well as renters compared to homeowners, which shouldn't be all that surprising considering some potential homeowners may not have a mortgage anymore. And so there's a little bit of effect there for people that are just, I have no housing cost. So lucky them. I can say that as I live in San Francisco. So as I mentioned, state policymakers are attempting to kind of look for ways to provide more affordable housing in California. And so we thought it would be timely to ask about 3 housing proposals. The one that garners the least support is the idea of reducing state regulations by changing the California Environmental Quality Act. And that garners just under half of Californians support this idea. Republicans and independents, about half, say they favor this idea compared to about 4 in 10 Democrats. When we look at the other 2 proposals, we find that about 6 in 10 Californians say that requiring local governments to approve new housing before they receive transportation funding, they support that. And about 6 in 10 support requiring local governments to change zoning for new development from single family homes to multi-family housing near transit and job centers. That's basically the crux behind SB 50, which it looks like is probably going to have to be addressed next year. What we find is that For both of these issues, we find that Republicans are far less likely than Democrats to favor either of these proposals. And on all three proposals, we find that homeowners are less likely than renters to support these ideas, and that African Americans and Latinos are less likely than Asian Americans and whites to support the latter two proposals. So the governor recently released his May Revise, which in addition to the May Revise also included a new proposal on how to address homelessness, a $1 billion plan. But before looking at those two proposals, it would be nice to kind of see how Californians perceive the issues of the state budget situation as well as homelessness. And what we find is that fewer than half of Californians view the state budget situation as a big problem. However, there are some partisan divides there. That's about 3 in 4 Republicans call the state budget situation a big problem compared to 1 in 3 Democrats on that. We find that there's a regional divide as well, with about half in the Inland Empire and the Central Valley saying that the state budget situation is a big problem compared to just about 4 in 10 in other regions. And about half of African Americans and whites compared to 4 in 10 Asian Americans and Latinos say that the state budget situation is a big problem. When we look at the issue of homelessness, we find that there's a sharp increase there, with just over 6 in 10 Californians saying that homelessness is a big problem in their part of California. There's still a partisan divide, but it's slightly less in this case, with a majority across parties saying that homelessness is a problem in their part of California. And so turning to look at the governor's budget proposals, which the overall budget proposal that he released includes increased spending on K-14 education, health and human services, higher education. It also proposes $4 billion to eliminate budgetary debts and recent deferrals, as well as putting $1.8 billion in the rainy day fund to bring that total to $16.5 billion. And when we read that kind of brief summary that I just provided, about 6 in 10 Californians support the governor's budget proposal. This is similar to the findings that we found in January when he initially presented his budget. Of course, there are definitely partisan divides here, with Democrats just about 3 times more likely than Republicans to be in favor of his budget proposal, while nearly 6 in 10 independents say they favor his budget proposal. When we look at his $1 billion proposal to address homelessness, we see that even more Californians are supportive of this, which shouldn't necessarily be a shock considering the shares of people that we saw in the last slide that viewed homelessness as a big problem. And so what we see here is that support is higher among Democrats and independents, but you do see an increase among Republicans when it comes to his homelessness proposal as compared to his overall proposal. About 7 in 10 across regions are in favor of this proposal to address homelessness, and 2 in 3 or more across demographic groups. So it's a pretty widely held belief that support for this homelessness proposal. And we find that about 8 in 10 women are in favor of this proposal to address homelessness compared to about 2 in 3 men. So given the recent measles outbreak nationwide, and we've seen that vaccines are kind of back in the news, there's also a bill in the legislature right now which would kind of look to limit some of the medical exemptions that people are using as it relates to the 2015 law, SB 277, which established kind of rules around the requirement for parents to vaccinate kids before they go to school. So nearly 3 in 4 Californians think that parents should be required to vaccinate their children. African Americans are far less likely than other racial ethnic groups to hold this view. And in this case, we're actually seeing partisan agreement with more than 7 in 10 across party groups saying that parents should have to vaccinate their kids. And we find that solid majorities, at least 6 in 10 across regions and demographic groups, say that children should be vaccinated. When we look at a national poll by the NBC Wall Street Journal folks, we see that mainly similar findings, with 72% across the nation saying that children should be vaccinated. In an adjacent question, we also asked about the safety of vaccines, and we found that 6 in 10 Californians say that vaccines like the ones for measles, mumps, and rubella are very safe, and another 1 in 4 say they're at least somewhat safe. And there are strong majorities across parties and regions hold this view, with African Americans once again less likely than other racial ethnic groups to view vaccines as safe. So as I mentioned, there's an outbreak of measles nationwide, and thus far it's been the worst outbreak that we've seen in the last 20 years. There's nearly 1,000 cases, new cases nationwide, and nearly 50 in California. And what we find is that about 8 in 10 Californians are concerned about the current outbreak becoming more widespread, with just over 4 in 10 saying that they're very concerned. Women are much more likely than men to say that they're very concerned, and the San Francisco Bay Area is the least likely to be very concerned on this topic. So changing topics to look at the perception of Californians when it comes to violence and street crime in their local communities. We find that just 1 in 4 Californians view violence and street crime as a big problem in their local community. 2 years ago, we saw a similar share holding this view. We have partisan agreement once again on this issue. And across regions, Orange County and San Diego County are the least likely to say that violence and street crime is a big problem in their local community. And the share who say it is a big problem actually declines with rising education and income. So there's some kind of socioeconomic factors when it comes to how people feel regarding crime in this area. And African Americans and Latinos are about twice as likely as Asians and as Asian Americans and whites to view their local violence and street crime as a big problem. So looking beyond crime to policing, we find that most Californians think that local police treat all racial and ethnic groups fairly, at least most of the time. There's somewhat of a partisan divide here, although majorities across parties do say that police treat all racial ethnic groups fairly most of the time. 8 in 10 Republicans compared to about half of Democrats. And what we find is that just 32% of African Americans say that this is the case, compared to 6 in 10 Latinos, 7 in 10 whites, and Asian Americans. And we find that 7 in 10 or more across people in Orange, San Diego, as well as San Francisco Bay Area and the Central Valley, say that police treat all racial ethnic groups fairly most of the time, compared to about 6 in 10 in the Inland Empire and Central Valley, or in LA, sorry. So it's a pretty widely held view that police are doing a good job as it relates to treating all racial ethnic groups fairly. So transitioning to our national issues section, what we find is that President Trump's approval continues to hold steady. And actually, since we began asking about it in January 2017, his approval has basically ranged from 25% to a high of 34% today. So a very narrow range when it comes to the fluctuation, but definitely partisan driven. And this is pretty much the case that we see nationwide as well. What we see is that overwhelming shares of Republicans, nearly 9 in 10, approve of the president. But outside of Republicans, fewer than half across regions and demographic groups actually approve of the president. And we look at ratings of Congress. Once again, we find partisan agreement with pretty much fewer than 3 in 10 across parties approving of the job that Congress does. And congressional ratings are fairly low across all regions and demographic groups. When we compare kind of Californians to those nationwide, according to a Gallup poll, we find that they're slightly more likely nationwide to approve of the president at 42%, and they're slightly less likely to approve of Congress at 20%. So even though only 30% approve of Congress in California, that's actually an improvement compared to adults nationwide. So next we take a look at the Mueller Report. I would like to thank Special Counsel Mueller for briefing this subject the day after we finished our polling, because had it been the day before, that would have caused a little bit of problems, but he was very timely in his manner to speak. And what we see is that nearly 6 in 10 Californians believe that the investigation did not clear Trump of all wrongdoing. Of course, there's a partisan divide on this, and the perception that the report did not clear him of all wrongdoing is highest in Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area, as you might expect, at about 6 in 10, compared to it being the lowest in the Inland Empire at 46%. Whites are much more likely than other racial ethnic groups, as well as those who are 55 and older, than other age groups to think that the report cleared Trump of all wrongdoing. And when we look at Americans nationwide, we find that 53% of Americans in a ABC Washington Post poll hold that view. So they're more likely to they're slightly less likely to say that it cleared him of all wrongdoing. But just because that's the case, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's the same kind of support for the idea of beginning impeachment proceedings. So what we see today is that Californians are divided on the issue of whether or not to begin impeachment proceedings. We find, of course, that 2 in 3 Democrats are in favor of this idea. But outside of that, we find that very few Republicans and just 4 in 10 independents believe that impeachment proceedings should begin. And we see that 2 in 3 African Americans and Latinos, compared to about half of Asian Americans and whites, say that impeachment proceedings should begin. And about half of women say that impeachment proceedings should begin, compared to about half of men who say they should not begin. So there is a divide there. And when we look at adults nationwide in a recent ABC News Washington Post poll, we find that fewer than 4 in 10 say that impeachment proceedings should begin, compared to about 56% that say that they should not begin. So closely tied to the Mueller report is the concept of the legitimacy of our elections. Specifically, looking at the 2016 elections, Californians are divided when it comes to whether or not interference by Russia undermined the legitimacy of the 2016 presidential elections. Once again, a big partisan divide there, but we find that nearly 6 in 10 independents are saying that it did not rise to that level. And once again, in that ABC Washington Post poll, we found that about 4 in 10 said it did not undermine the legitimacy of the election, compared to nearly half. 4 in 10 said it did, compared to nearly half who said it did not. So not too different than Californians overall. However, when we take the look at the 2020 election, what we do find is that over half of Californians think that interference by Russia or other countries actually does threaten the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Once again, here we see nearly 6 in 10 likely voters hold this view. Over half of independents, as well as 3 in 4 Democrats, think that this interference does threaten, compared to nearly 7 in 10 Republicans who says that it does not potentially threaten the legitimacy. At least half across demographic groups outside of men, who are at 49%, say that these future disruptions could potentially interfere with the legitimacy of the election. And women are 10 points more likely than men to say that Russian interference or other countries' interference could threaten the legitimacy of the election. Nationwide, pretty similar findings. 53% say that interference by Russia and other countries nationwide does threaten their legitimacy. So there is an interesting dynamic that, looking back, they don't think it actually impacted the 2016 election, but that there is the possibility that it could threaten the 2020 election. So speaking of 2020, we wanted to take a look at how Californians are perceiving the idea of participating in the census. And we wanted to at least be able to provide some context to that when it comes to how they feel about voting in 2020. And what we see is that with the census potentially being controversial regarding the inclusion of a census question, thank you, which could dampen participation, we find that 3 in 4 Californians actually think it's very important to participate in the 2020 census, and 3 in 4 across parties, 7 in 10 across regions and demographic groups, and similar shares of people born in the U.S. and those who are foreign-born say that it's very important to participate in the census. We look at voting, we find that 9 in 10 across parties, 8 in 10 across regions and demographic groups say that it's very important to vote in 2020. So it's an elevated level of importance, but once again, 3 in 4 Californians view that participating in the census is very important. So at least some of the discussion about the 2020 census is about the concern of keeping answers confidential, especially as it relates to the citizenship question. And what we find is that 63% of Californians are at least somewhat concerned about this, with Democrats, about 3 in 4 Democrats compared to about half of Republicans expressing concern. Latinos are the most likely across racial and ethnic groups, with nearly 3 in 4 being very concerned, and 7 in 10 in Los Angeles are very concerned, while fewer elsewhere express this level of concern. While we didn't see a difference in the U.S.-born versus foreign-born when it came to the importance of participating, we do see a difference when it comes to the concern, with 7 in 10 of those who are foreign-born expressing concern compared to less than 6 in 10 of those who are U.S.-born. So there's a little bit of a difference there. And in a February Census Bureau survey that they did, 72% of Americans nationwide are at least somewhat concerned. So California isn't necessarily out of the loop on this. So looking at the 2020 election, I'd first like to say that yes, we haven't begun looking specifically at the Democratic primary and that, but we did want to at least, given we're less than a year out from the election, at least be able to provide some context for how Californians are feeling about the 2020 election. And what we find is that 34% of likely voters say that they will definitely or probably vote for President Trump, while about 2 in 3 Californians say that they will probably vote for someone else. The 34% of likely voters who would support President Trump is very similar to his approval rating. And so that's something that we've seen on a number of issues as it relates to the president, whether it be voting for him in this case or support for building a wall. There's about a third of Californians who are supportive of those policies. And that's pretty consistent, whether it be, as I said, like just approving of him or voting for him or the wall. Across racial and ethnic groups, we find the majorities of Latinos, whites, and other groups would vote for someone else. And I should note, when we were discussing likely voters, we aren't able to break out specific findings for Asian Americans and African Americans, but they are included in another group that kind of combines the rest of the racial ethnic groups as compared to Latinos and whites. And the share that say that they're going to probably or definitely vote for Donald Trump increases with rising age. In a recent Fox News poll, we found that, or they found that just over half of adults nationwide said that they would probably vote for someone else. So the 2 in 3 Californians isn't necessarily all that different than the adults nationwide. So we've asked a question in recent years about the concept of which is more important to you in a presidential candidate, new ideas and a different approach, or experience and a proven record. And so what this chart is showing is that we've seen a 8-point increase since December 2015 in the share of people who say experience and a proven record is more important. We find that Democrats are slightly less likely to say that, although still we find that half say that experience is more important. But what's noteworthy here is this Republican likely voter finding where about 1 in 3 in December 2015 said that experience was more important than new ideas, while today we find that 6 in 10 Republican likely voters and Californians are saying that experience is more important. We also see an increase in the share of independent likely voters who say that experience is more important than new ideas. And we find we also wanted to at least get at the issue of the decision-making process among those who are likely going to decide who California supports in the Democratic primary. So we asked this question of registered Democrats and independents who say they lean more towards the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. And so what we find here is that likely voters are fairly divided on this concept of whether they would prefer a candidate whose positions on issues comes closest to theirs or the candidate who seems most likely to defeat Donald Trump. What we see here is that there's definitely an age effect here with half of those younger likely voters saying that they prefer someone whose positions on issues are close to theirs, while about half of older likely voters saying that they just want that they would prefer someone who seems most likely to defeat Donald Trump. And so when we look at that subgroup, we find that independents are more likely than Democrats to say that they prefer someone who whose views are closest to theirs. So as we move closer to the 2020 primary, we'll be coming back to this topic. We have a July environment survey that probably won't ask about this, but as we move closer to September and November, December, we'll come back to the issue and hopefully figure out a good way to ask about 25 and counting Democratic hopefuls. And so it's creating a challenge not just for pollsters in California, but nationwide. And so we're still just want to see where we are as far as methodology and how we should best approach this issue, because reading a list of 25 candidates on a phone potentially isn't necessarily fun for the people doing the interviewing or the person on the other end of the line. So that will be something that we continue to look at. And so in conclusion, we find that 8 in 10 Californians are concerned that their electricity bills could increase as a result of wildfire damages and the PG&E bankruptcy. We find that Californians across partisan lines in somewhat rare agreement find that homelessness where they live is a big problem. We find that many Californians believe that vaccines for measles and other diseases are very safe and should be required by parents. Most Californians believe that the Mueller report did not clear President Trump of all wrongdoing, but they are more divided when it comes to the idea of proceeding with impeachment. And when it comes to the 2020 primary, Republicans overwhelmingly want to re-elect President Trump, while most Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents are more divided about what they're looking for in a candidate, whether it's someone's closest to their views or someone that they feel can beat President Trump. And I think that really goes to the heart of how many people are feeling when it comes to the actual kind of Democratic primary. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions, and if you could just remember to wait for a microphone as this is being videotaped.
Hey, thank you. I was wondering, in terms of the question of experience among Republicans, that was a pretty big shift, as you noticed. And was there any correlation you saw between whether that was coming more from Republicans who are fans of Trump or Republicans that aren't fans of Trump?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't had a chance to look at that. It's definitely something of interest, but our kind of timeline for getting the survey out is of a nature that kind of limits those types of questions, but that will be something that we look at in the coming days and weeks for sure, because it's an important issue of, is it that 1 in 3 who approve of him, or is it kind of other people who are looking for potential others? So, yes. Right here.
Hi, so I had a question on your slide where you talked about the policing and the racial ethnic groups.
Yes.
So in your question, one of your options were some of the time, if you thought they were just full some of the time. I didn't see that in the chart. Was it because you got no responses, or was it too minimal to even show up on the chart?
No, we just chose to kind of, it's sometimes difficult to show all the categories, and so we just stuck to that as far as the breakdown. But all of that is in the report, and actually we have crosstabs online where you can actually kind of look and see whether younger people or older people or across racial ethnic groups and whatnot actually feel that way. But yes, there was a share of people who said at least who said some of the time. Let's see if I can find that rather quickly. So yeah, it was only some of the time was about 1 in 5 Californians said only some of the time. 1 in 10 said almost never. So that's about 3 in 10 on the kind of flip side of that category. Yes. Well, with that, I'd like to thank everyone and be expecting a survey a little bit later this afternoon. Please do it, because your feedback, whether it be about the beer bread or me personally or the chairs, is very important. So thank you.